those details. So it makes me kind of think that maybe that wasn't the case. Because usually they give us as much information, and they probably would have given us a little bit more information if that was a particular case. So, what I think may have happened was this was found at a Confederate surgeon site. So to give you an idea of how a battlefield would be set up, you'd have a battlefield, and 1 to 2 miles out, you'd have a field dressing station. That's essentially their main goal there is just to stop the bleeding. That's where they do triage. That's where they're trying to figure out, is this something that we can fix? Is this something that can, just be a quick fix and we can send them right back out into the field, or do we need to send them onto the hospital? So your field hospital is going to be at 3 to 4 miles out from that point, and that's really where you're going to be seeing your surgeons. Now, in the case of a battle, which this was found at the Battle of, I think, Nashville. I say that and I'm not as sure, but I'm pretty sure it was Nashville. It was possibly buried at the Confederate field hospital. Oftentimes, if they were going to be retreating, they would have a hole dug, probably to actually throw body parts in later on at some point. But they would also maybe be using it as a spot where they put heavy items like this that they wanted to keep, but they wanted to keep out of enemy hands. But you can't flee very well when you're adding on about 50 pounds of stuff to your back or to your horse. So you would bury heavy items like this with the hopes that you could come back and retrieve it later. So that's possibly how they knew it was Confederate surgeons' kits. They found it near a Confederate surgeons' hospital. I guess it's like field hospital. There we go. All right, so before I get into all of this, I'd like to kind of paint a picture for everyone. So when you think about the people that were at these different battlefields, most of these were younger men. They were from rural communities. They'd been from smaller communities that had never been around a lot of people before. So a lot of these people, this was the first time they were in big sets of population from lots of different areas. So what you're getting is a lot of confluence of diseases, really, where people are being exposed to new things like typhoid or typhus or malaria. You also have a whole bunch of diseases just brought in naturally because of the circumstance of it in camp or a battlefield. You have a lot of rodents, you have a lot of mosquitoes and fleas bringing in different diseases as well. If you think about a camp setup, let's just say it was gross. They didn't really think about where their water was coming from in relation to where their latrines were set up, so you get a lot of contamination that way. You also have really poor supply lines sometimes for food and a variety of food. So the 2 main diseases that you really see in the Civil War are diarrhea and dysentery. And it's just because they just didn't understand how germs were related with everything, and they didn't understand what they needed in a proper diet to keep everyone healthy. So you already have these weakened immune systems, you have these people surrounded by all these other people that have these different diseases that they have no immunity towards. So you already have this lovely setup of compromised immune systems. And then you add in all of the fun of war and all of the trauma that comes with that. And it's not surprising that you had such a high fatality count for the Civil War. So to kind of give you an idea of kind of a technology change that added into why this is such an interesting Civil War item. Before the Civil War, you had musket balls, which this is a pretty good example of a musket ball. It's just a round piece of lead usually. A lot of times your soldiers could make these in camp even. It's pretty easy. I think I was reading recently that there was like over 1,000 different types of ammunition used during the Civil War. And that was probably in part because they were using so many different molds and they were making them themselves for campfires because lead melts really easily. So you have these musket balls, and this is more old technology. And if you have a musket ball and you shoot it, it's gonna not go very straight. It's not gonna go very far, and it's not gonna have a lot of oomph behind it. So that's why you always have, standard procedure. You'll be shooting within like 50 feet. Your soldiers, wait till you see the whites of their eyes. You've all heard that expression, I'm sure. And the idea was that you have a much better chance of hitting what you're aiming at if you wait for the person to get close to you, because it was such an inaccurate shot. Now, then you have the mini bullet, or the Manet bullet, depending on who you talk to. It was invented by a Frenchman by the name of Manet. And from my research, it seems that his intentions were noble in a way. He was trying to make a more effective weapon so that wars were over more quickly, therefore decreasing how many people were involved and injured in a war, so making it more decisive, if you will. It in fact did the exact opposite, just caused even more trauma and just made it much more bloody. So your mini bullet, what's different is obviously the shape. It's larger, but it's also more conical shaped, so more football shaped. It has rifling down the sides, and on the bottom it has kind of a hollowness to it. I'm gonna hand this over here and you can pass it around. So what this does for the bullet when it's being used in a rifle is that conical shape and that rifling really lets it have a nice twist, just like how if you throw a football, you get a really nice straight shot. You can go pretty far and it has a lot of force to it. And so this is it's gonna be a lot more effective when it goes. Also, because it has that hollowness on the backside, metal, when it heats up, it actually expands, so that thinner rim on the back kind of flares out a little bit and flattens the bullet a little bit. So if you get hit with a musket ball, this nice little round piece of lead, it would probably snap a bone in half, and that's easy to come back from. That's something they knew how to kind of set a broken bone, and they could usually fix that. Now the mini bullet, it would actually shatter probably 2 to 3 inches of bone, and that was something they just didn't know how to fix. And that's why you start seeing so many amputations. In fact, recent number I saw was that probably as much as 80% of all of the surgeries that happened during the Civil War were amputations. And so really, it's just, if you think about that and then how many people that was and also the limbs, it's a little disturbing. Fascinating though, right? Yeah.
If those that have held the bullet know that the bullet is kind of tipsy because the weight is on one end. It's done that way so that as the bullet starts to go into the air, it will begin to tumble. It's designed to go ahead and to become a tumbling bullet, not go into you just straight. It's intended on ripping a hole in you. When it gets there within 50 yards, it will rip a hole. It don't go in clean. And then when it comes out the other side, it will be about twice the size in length and width on that bullet. So,
And yeah, so if it hit you on the trunk of your body, it's going to ricochet essentially on the inside of your body. So very, very nasty how it works in actuality. So if you think about all of that, it makes sense that a surgeon's kit would be such a fascinating item because of its high use and its importance in the Civil War battlefield. So the kit that I have here is more of a general surgeon's kit. It's not a specific military issue. So it has a lot of additional items in it that really make it a lot more interesting, even than just its Civil War aspect. Has anyone ever heard of a trephining tool to trephine? So the trephining tool, I can't pull it out unfortunately, but I'll show you guys later. Let's see if I can set this up a little bit. It's these two tools here that have kind of a circular top, so it is a circular saw. And if you look at it, it's probably about the size of one is about the size of like a dime, the other one's about the size of maybe a nickel. So these are some small circles. Now this concept actually goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, which is pretty neat, considering that's still not terribly effective at this point, but they're still doing it, which is great. So what they would do is if you got a blow to the head, you would have some swelling and you probably had some internal bleeding. And so they were right in this thought that if they removed that small circular portion of bone, they could relieve that pressure and have some of that blood come out so you don't have that pressure build up. However, as we've already kind of talked a little bit, they had no idea that there was germs. And so you're directly putting in whatever contamination is on this tool, you're putting straight into your bloodstream by your brain. Most of the cells that show trephining do not have regrowth, which means they did not survive the procedure. Every once in a while you do see one that has some regrowth and they obviously survived for some time after, but it's very unusual to find that, yeah. Also in here, if I can show you again, there's also these lovely things here. For anyone who's ever had a child, these should be very disturbing to you. But this is exactly what that's for, is for childbirth, for caring for women. It's a little bit strange, but still, this is a full surgeon's kit, so it's really interesting to see all the different pieces they have. They even have a hypodermic needle, which is really fun. But okay, I'm gonna walk you through an amputation. Does anyone need to step out of the room, or is everyone good? And say, if you feel the need, I will not be offended, so that's okay. All right, so.
Here's your demonstration subject, that might be important.
I've learned that most people aren't willing to be demonstration subjects, so I'm not asking. I mean, if anyone wants to, I'm not sure how sharp these knives are, so it might take a while. In fact, a question for you, how long do you guys think an amputation would generally take? And those who know my answer, like Terry and maybe Steve, don't tell me the answer, because I am. Does anyone have any guesses how long it would take?
Half hour.
Half
Or
hour?
better.
That's a good guess. That's a good guess.
Second.
Hmm?
Probably a minute.
A minute? Oh.
15 minutes.
Now, if it was a cannonball, it would take less than a minute. And that happened. Anyone have any other guesses on time?
I'll go for 15.
15. You are very close. Generally about 10 minutes to do an amputation. It's a very quick procedure. Again, there's no stops in between for sanitizing. You just get it done. And then you move on to the next person. You have to think about when people are at that field dressing station or at that field hospital, there's so much happening in those situations, and most of the surgeons and any kind of help they have been up maybe for the entirety of the battle doing this. So that could be 5 hours, that could be 12 hours, that could be 30 hours. And so they're getting things done in as quick and as efficient in their minds as possible.
Also
So,
less sharp.
very quick how it goes. Yeah, hopefully it was sharp. Hopefully it was sharp. All
No,
right.
it's less shock.
Oh, less sharp.
That's part of why they amputate fast. Get it over with less shock.
Yeah. For the one person, everyone else around them is shocked though. All right, so what you want to start out with first is you have your tourniquet here, and you put that wherever you needed to. Generally, if you had to have below your elbow or below your knee amputated, you had a much better survival rate. You have much smaller blood vessels there. They had much less to tie off and worry about. Now, if it was above the elbow, above the knee, you might survive. It's much less likely though, just because you have such, your blood vessels are so much bigger and you have more of them, and they would tie them off as best they could. You kind of wonder if they always hit all of them though, from what I'm reading in different medical texts, that it was hard for them to do, especially because they were moving so quickly. So you use your tourniquet, and then the next tool you would use is one of these different amputation saws. And I think I can't pull one of these out. So these are pretty wicked looking. So this would be what you cut through all of the fleshy bit with. So there'd be two different ways that you would do an amputation. Pretty quick and easy would be just to do a circle. Just cut a clear circle straight down to the bone, and then you pull that flesh back so you have something to cover afterwards. You would have a bone saw, or not a bone saw, a bone file, so you could file down the end of that bone so it's not going to poke out later, because obviously you don't want to ruin your work. So you'd file it down and then take that flesh and pull it back over and stitch it closed. Also, if you had a good enough cut, if you had enough skin left over, you would do a half circle and come down with a flap, pull that back so you could then cover the area with that when you were done. And that would be a much cleaner looking amputation than if they just did a circle. Again, the circle was probably the most commonly used just because it was the quickest and most easily efficient one to do. Does that make sense? I know you guys are just, this is exciting. So once they cut through the flesh, then they would pull out, your bone saw, which is what we all see and get a little queasy about, I think. So you go through the bone saw, and then you go through and file it down, like I said, and stitch it up. And like I said, about 10 minutes. This was not a complicated process. Should it have been more complicated? Probably. but it wasn't, it was really quick and easy for them.
How did they tie off the veins? Did they pull
Yeah.
out
Silk
and then?
thread, sometimes they tied up with silk thread, and we do have bundles of the thread here that we use. Again, it probably depended on at what point your surgeon was at, whether they were in their first 5 hours or their 20th hour, on how good they were doing. And you're also thinking about, it's ideal if you get injured earlier in the battle than later, because that bucket of water that they might use to clean up their tools in between is probably a lot less dirty than it is 20 hours in. Because oftentimes they use the same bucket, and they would only use that for their tools if it like dropped on the floor and got dust or dirt on it, but they were like, oh, that's kind of gross to do. So they'd stick it in that same bucket maybe. Otherwise, they're wiping it off on their smock, moving on to the next person, only when they need to wipe it off on their smock. So that's the other thing, is that anyone who has a disease, blood disease, or an infection themselves, you're carrying it from one person to another. Like I said, it's really pretty gross. when
Would
you
they
start thinking about all of
cauterize
that.
when they cut, before they sewed up, would they try to cauterize the flesh?
I've not read anything where they were. Some maybe did, depending on the situation, what kind of injury it was. But I've not read that specifically.
I would
So I'm
think
not
that
sure.
could be quicker than having to tie off a bunch of veins.
It probably would have, but I think it would have added more steps, and I don't think they did that. I don't think they added more steps to the procedure. They were very much quick and dirty to it. Now, sometimes, depending on how the injury was, they might take the time to do a probe and pull out the bullet beforehand if they needed to. Sometimes it wasn't an issue depending on what type of injury it was. They would just go in and do the amputation. So, now my favorite question for people. Do you guys think they had anesthesia? Raise your hands if you do. Oh.
Risky.
Yeah, this is always my favorite question. So this comes from the Civil War Medical Museum, and I've done my own research with other ones too. 95% of all surgeries had anesthesia. So the North favored ether, the South favored chloroform, and it probably had to do with what materials they had available and what type of distilleries and stuff were nearby where they could have manufactured it. Now that other 5% where they didn't, that was probably because of blockade or because the person already passed out. You wouldn't waste your medicine if you didn't need to. So, the reason why so many people believe that that was the case, if they didn't have anesthesia, is kind of a complicated answer, but it's a really interesting one. So, if you think about it, at the time, they didn't have a lot of any of these medications. And so for the anesthesia, they actually were developing things like the ether cone, so that they could actually give you a lower dosage. So you aren't getting a full dose to put you completely under. You're getting just enough to desensitize yourself from pain. And what that means is that your body's gonna kind of react to that more than it would otherwise. So you might be moving around or moaning even. So giving the appearance to everyone else that you're not fully under, that you haven't been necessarily given anything. And you have to consider this too, is like I said, these are mostly rural boys that have never been in any kind of situation like this before. They have no baseline knowledge for what a surgery should look like, or what a field hospital should look like, or what it looks like outside of maybe the farm, where they lived before, where they saw animals being taken care of. This is completely new to them. And so they're seeing these things happen, and they don't know how to interpret it. And if you take it one step further and think about where they're at right now. So where we get a lot of these stories are from letters that get sent home, or the things that people were telling after they came home from the war. And so most people that are talking about this have either been at that field hospital, or potentially even at the field dressing station. So the people that are there are either injured, or else they've pulled an injured friend off of the battle, or else they're helping the surgeons because they've been recruited to do it, not because they really know what they're doing. They're just an extra set of hands. These people, they are in a state of trauma. So they're experiencing their own PTSD in that moment, and they are also potentially not in their right mind because they're injured. And they're coming up with this idea, they're trying to rationalize what they're seeing, Like everyone, when you're in that situation, you're trying to grasp what you see and make sense of it. And so they're making sense of the fact that they see people moving and making noise, and they're going, oh, these people are having their nose cut off, and they're not being given anything for it. And anesthesia issue is still somewhat new. It had only really come around in the 1840s. So it had been adopted by the Civil War, but it was still something that was new enough that if you're from a rural community, you weren't gonna really know a lot about anesthesia. So this is all very new, and again, like I said, they have no baseline knowledge for it. So it's really it's very understandable that these stories came about, and they're so widespread, and anyone, people love a sensational story, and what's more sensational than someone getting an arm cut off and not being given anything but maybe, a stick of wood or a strap of leather in their mouth, which may have been done to keep them from biting their tongue, but it gives that impression there. Which again, it's a sensational story. What I always like to tell people is that just because someone writes about something, doesn't mean they have a clue what they're writing about. And that's exactly what's happening here. So it's kind of interesting. Something else I always like to talk about is the idea, kind of goes along with this, is the idea of biting the bullet. Have you guys heard that expression before? Now what's fun about this, what I found out with this is one of the rabbit trails I went down when I was researching civil medicine a while back, is biting the bullet. If you were biting a bullet in the middle of surgery, do you think that would be a good idea? To have a small, hard object that you're potentially going to swallow and choke on? No, that's a terrible idea. So the reason why you get this idea though, is that you find bullets that have what look like teeth marks in them. So what other explanation can we possibly have? Well, if you think about the battlefields, do you think afterwards that everyone was like, all right, now let's all get out there and let's go clean up. Let's just work together and pick up all the little things that are left behind? No, it gets left there, grass grows up, weeds grow up, stuff falls. It just becomes part of nature a little bit. And one of the things that loves nature and loves to pick up anything on the ground is a pig. And pigs will go through and they'll kind of truffle around and they'll pick things up, and pigs pick up just about anything. You ever have seen pigs, they'll try and eat everything around them. And they're really good about biting down and then spitting out whatever is not food. Pigs' teeth are really similar to our molar teeth, and that's where you get those impressions from. So more than likely, the majority of bullets that have what look like human teeth marks on them, because they're lead, so they're soft, are actually pig teeth. So it's kind of fun. So I'm sorry for ruining that for you. Now, yes, Diane?
I can't remember when in history it was, but there was some time when they knew that if they chewed the bullets before they shot them, they would cause more infection.
I have heard that. I'm not sure when that would have been, but I'm not seeing that with my Civil War research. So
Was
I'm
that
not sure
the
if it was
person who
Civil War.
chewed it, or? Well, they're legs, so it's not healthy to bite or chew these things either, but.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I have heard that. I have heard that before, but I'm not sure in relation to Civil War if that was
I
that.
can't remember what the time period was.
Now, I'm kind of done at this point. This is not a long presentation. Usually it's when everyone comes up and asks me all the questions. But before that, does anyone have any questions for me?
What kind of training do the surgeons have?
Surgeons would often be training underneath a previous surgeon. So they would be learning from someone who was in the trade. They didn't really necessarily go to school for it. I'm sure there were some schools who were teaching things, but from what I have seen, it seems often that some would be more of apprentice. So I would guess that the training varied quite a bit from one person to another. I don't think there was very many standards at that point. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
If I remember right too, there were not that many Army doctors, period.
There weren't, and so oftentimes you have people that just knew some medicine that would be doing this. Now this is a nice surgeon's kit, and like I said, this was a surgeon's kit that was not military issued, so this was from an actual trained surgeon. Now again, trained being what you will, but this was someone who had actually been using this as a profession. This is a kit that was actually shipped in from England originally. So it is a nice full surgeon's kit. You had a question?
In your opinion, what were probably the biggest medical innovations or developments that occurred during the course of the Civil War that still has an impact on our
current day to know exactly. I would say that, probably, there had to have been so much knowledge gained from all the amputations, all the surgeries they did, and just how the body functions together, and how to heal from that, and how people learn to use their bodies differently. When you've lost an arm or a leg, I think there's a lot of innovation in that aspect with wheelchairs and such, and crutches and things like that. As far as like the surgeries go, I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I wish I did, because that was a really good question.
Was Clara Barton in the Civil War?
Yes.
Yes.
And didn't she decide how diseases got passed from,
I
wasn't she
think
the
she was
innovator
there
in
at
that?
the beginning with figuring out germ theory and all of that.
Yes, germ theory.
Mhm.
So I think Clara Barton did.
Which that would be a pretty big thing. I guess I went more mechanical with it.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were experimenting with morphine during the Civil War, and that's still in use in various forms.
And I really haven't read a lot about it though. I think it was pretty new when they were using morphine. Mostly just,
Learning how to use it.
yeah. Any other questions?
Well, you know, the Chinese brought in poppies before the
Yeah,
Civil
you did
War,
have
right?
opium.
Yeah, opium
Mhm.
might have been
I
right.
don't think that was used a lot. I think that was probably more expensive to get than you would ether or chloroform. I think they were both a little bit easier to manufacture. Let's see.
Kind of give you an idea, asking about medical situations. Okay, and of course, at the Lane House, Member Lane talked and solicited and received 1,000 volunteers to go to the Mexican War. They stood outside the Lane House, there in Lane's yard, if you can imagine, 1,000 men getting ready to go off and march to the Mexican War. Now, at that time, the reason I'm emphasizing this is that if I remember right, and don't hold me to this, but there was, when Lane came back, Lane was sick, I mean nauseated about the war going to Mexico.
Yeah.
Because he lost close to 1/3 of those people, and they never fired a shot. They went down and they were guards at Mexico, along the Texas border, Rio Grande. They never fired a bullet, they were never in a war, and he lost 1/3 of the cousins. Some of them were cousins of his, there were dads, there were brothers, because they were gonna go down and fight Mexico for the
It was for
1830.
the 1846 Mexican-American War. That's when so Henry and Llewellyn both mustered on the front grounds of Lane Place. Like Steve said, about 1,000 individuals. They marched over to around New Mexico kind of area, were there for a year or two, and they lost about 1/3 of their people
Yeah.
to disease and to just the,
And dysentery, it was because of lack of sanitation.
mhm.
What had never one being shot.
By any chance, do we have any stories about, patient agency on the battlefield? So like, say, for example, you know, if so-and-so XYZ soldier knew that XYZ surgeon had a better quote-unquote success rate than the other surgeon, could they say like, hey, you know, if I'm gonna get my leg cut off, I want it to be cut off by this guy, not that guy? Like, do we have any stories of record of soldiers requesting certain surgeon?
From everything I have read, if you are injured, you go to the nearest person you can get to. I don't think because these people didn't understand medical,
Right.
how that worked. They'd never been to a doctor potentially, they didn't know what a surgeon really did. They had no concept of patient agency. So I think it was more just that this has happened, someone fix this. This person here cuts things, we'll go to them. So I don't think there was any thought process there from what I've read about that knowledge. You probably have that more with your captains, your generals who know more. But as far as your everyday soldier, I don't think it was a thought they had, unfortunately.
The battle would be pretty chaotic.
And that's what I'm thinking, is that really they're probably just lucky to get off the battlefield to that field dressing station in the first place. Yeah, well, if you look at how the battles were, have you guys ever seen a Civil War log? So if you think about, like, a Civil War log, for those who don't know, it's a chunk of tree that will have multiple things embedded in it. And so if you just think about that, how much stuff was getting thrown out at once, and how you could have that, a chunk of tree that has multiple different, like, you know, this is a little, now I lost my word for this, but this little ball is an idea of what like a big cannonball would be. But different different sizes of those balls, from like around a quarter size up to like my fist or bigger. And you have all of these embedded in a log. You just think about how all of them can get embedded in that one tree. Think about what a forest is gonna look like when you're trying to move through it. You're lucky to move through it.
Basketball. Basketball.
Yeah, basketball, thank you, Terry.
Basketball, there you go.
You mentioned that the ammunition was mostly lead.
Yeah.
What are the tools made out of?
The tools are probably most likely silver or iron. I'm not sure what this set is made out of. What you do see later on is that, like this tool here, you start seeing the handles become metal once they realize they can sterilize things. Before that, they realize that the plastic, or if they have wooden, would be most likely what you normally see. It was really hard to sanitize those. You really couldn't keep the germs off of them. And yeah, these are actually wooden. I said plastic, but you guys know what I mean.
Where and how was that set acquired by you guys? Was it local or?
Yeah, so a soldier from Crawfordsville brought it back with them, and that's where they were the ones who told us it was Confederate surgeon's kit, but that's all the information they gave with it. So that's where I told you at the beginning that it was probably either potentially taken directly from a Confederate surgeon, but they didn't give us that information, so that's why I think it's potentially more likely that they found it buried at a site from a retreat.
In the handbook, it says that Dr. Sigmund, I mean, some people might remember a Dr. Sigmund in town, but he gave it to the Historical Society.
Yeah, I think it was
He
from that
retained it, so,
family,
yeah.
yeah.
During the battle, when all this was taking place, were there any conventions or agreements to try to not shoot at the dressing station or the hospital?
I've not heard that. My understanding that I think it would be kind of, just like how they didn't shoot at their officers generally, I think that would probably be understandable, that probably was a little bit of a understanding. Maybe later in the war that changed as their tactics started to change. But yeah, you don't really see a lot of mentions of field dressing stations under attack. But also, if you remember, I said that you have the battlefield, and those field dressing stations are about 1 mile to 2 miles out from that. So that would really help give them a good buffer. But also meant that you had to trek a good distance to get to them potentially. And then those field hospitals are going to be about 3 to 4 miles out. So they should be far enough away from the battlefield that it's not an issue, but it's not something I've really heard or read about.
Your sharpshooters, who were expert marksmen, would shoot 1,000 meters. They had weapons that would shoot them. They were after officers.
They were.
Because if you shoot the
You
officers,
start to have that, but
then
you
the
don't-
band disseminate, and they don't.
But that happened more in the Civil War later on, where you start seeing that happen more. Before that, it's more of a gentleman's kind of agreement.
Yeah.
You see that especially in earlier
It sounds
wars too.
great, but that's what they still do. I mean, that's war. That's just the way it is.
In the
Because if you kill
Revolutionary
the
War,
officer, there's nobody there to give orders for the rest of the men to go ahead and go.
in the Revolutionary War, it started out that they didn't shoot officers.
Mhm.
And then when the militia got involved, they started taking out English officers because that disrupted the battles more.
Yeah.
So-
That's true.
So I think by Civil War, they were attacking officers more.
Maybe I'm getting my things mixed up. I thought from some of the things I read that they didn't.
Maybe they did
still
that
didn't do it as
sometimes.
much. Could be.
I think it depended.
Hmm.
I think it depended on who was making the orders.
Yeah, it's one of those, you gotta remember, these are farm boys too, and they're just thinking, okay, that's the big league, I'm gonna shoot them.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true.
most of the officers for the getting to the school before the war broke out together, so we'd almost be like,
Well, and that's the thing, is most of them knew each other,
And knew
and so it was hard for them to say, well, like, at the end though, we'll go these
yeah,
people
once
again.
they were gone, and
So that's part of the mentality there.
This is a little afield from your subject, but
Mhm.
I'm curious if there's any information as to how prisoners were treated, how far they were moved and under what conditions and so forth. I've only heard about this book called Andersonville, which is a detailed story. I've never read it, but it has a lot of gruesome detail about horrible
Yeah.
circumstances. But from battlefield to prison or wherever they kept them, do you have any insight as to the distances and what conditions were involved?
I don't have a lot of insight on that. I would say, probably an educated guess from my point of view would be that if they had prisoners that were gravely injured, they probably didn't move them. They probably didn't take them with them. They probably left them to nature or maybe handle things themselves. Because if you think about it, like when you think about Andersonville, the North and South could barely take care of their own troops. They weren't going to be spending a lot of resources taking care of prisoners. You see that even more so on the South than the North. North had a little bit more flexibility there. The South in particular, they didn't have any extra resources to expend on prisoners, so the conditions were very bad. And so if you were considering any kind of medical help, it wasn't gonna go to them. It was gonna go to their own soldiers.
We had a speaker for the club talking about the brief POW camp in Lafayette, where they were getting so many sick and injured soldiers that they were not equipped to take care of in the camp, that they paid local families to take them in and take care of them. But what happened was, when they got better, the families didn't want to give them back. My son's away fighting, here's a boy of the same age, and he's helping with the chores. And eventually, they closed the camp in Lafayette, moved everybody up to Camp Morton in Indianapolis. They weren't getting them back.
Yeah, I've not heard anything about that. That's really interesting. But I cannot, it's hard for me to imagine the South would do the same thing.
South was very different.
Very different.
Yeah, got one for you.
Yeah.
My grandmother's grandmother, in the Civil War, lived in Troy, Montgomery County, North Carolina. Her husband, they had 5 kids. He was down with pneumonia, in bed, had not, about at least a week or so he'd been there. Confederates came into town. They were recruiting. So any male that they found between the age of 15 and 60 went into the Army, Confederate Army. And he was drafted in bed. Never picked the musket up. In fact, they picked his bed up and took it by wagon, up to Richmond, Virginia. He stayed in bed and had, they have cures for pneumonia at the time. And anyway, ultimately Richmond fell. Well, he got out of there just before Richmond fell. They had started evacuating hospitals. The Yankees caught up with him. They put him in the prisoner of war camp in New Jersey, and that's where he died. Never picked a musket up, fired, nothing, the whole time. And she had 5 kids, a clock and $5, something like that. Her sister, they were, what's the name of the church?
Quakers, thank you.
They were Quakers, and so she wrote to her sister who lived in Plainfield, south of Indianapolis. And her sister was also Quaker, family was, and so they ended up, they got money for her church and what have you. And she came through the Cumberland Gap in a wagon with her 5 kids. That was my grandmother's family. So kind of give you an idea of the way times were. They were tough, really tough.
Does anyone have any other questions for me? At this point, does anyone want to come up and see anything? I know you guys have the rest of your meeting to go on to, and I'll probably head out for that, so if you guys want to